Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a real pleasure to welcome back to the program from many years ago, the proprietor of the blog Eschaton. You know him as Atrios, or perhaps Duncan Black. Duncan, welcome back to the Majority Report.
Thanks very much, and congratulations on 20 years.
We played the first 2 minutes of the very first Majority Report. That was 20 years ago as of Sunday. And you were, I think, the second guest on the show ever. I think after Ben from Ben and Jerry's.
I think so. Yes. I was definitely on either the first night or the second night.
No, it was definitely the first night. I'm saying literally the second slot.
Okay.
And I want to just say, up front, when I started doing this, we were planning on what guests are we going to get? And I was like, we have to move fast to get Atrios, because if we don't get him first, we're going to get big-footed by Franken or these other. And I'm like, this is huge. We've got to do this. And we got you in for a test run. I think we did. We did a couple of test interviews, and of course, no one at Air America was even occurred to them to have a website. So the idea that, but I'll have to say that honestly, one of the most exciting things for me was meeting you at the Air America opening party that we had. That was like a big thing. It was.
Oh wow.
And
because I guess at this point, were you guys you're just on the radio? So did you have any idea?
No, we hadn't even started.
Well, I mean, meeting him. Oh, you meant him before the
this
show.
is before the show.
Okay.
We actually launched. I think it was maybe on the 29th or that we did this. I think it was, or the 30th. And it was great. And so it's real. I really am thankful that you're here today.
Yeah, glad to be here. Good to see you.
And I should also say, I still read your blog every day. It's one of the first things I read. But all right, let's start with this, because I want to talk about where we are today. The ICJ this morning, I guess, basically came out and said, to Israel, you need to open up. And this, I think, is binding, at least to the extent that anything is binding. You need to open up more land routes to provide aid to Gaza. This is coming 4 days after the U.S. certified that Israel is not, I guess, inhibiting aid into Gaza. Just let me know your thoughts on this, and then I want to talk about where we are relative to where we were when you and I started this kind of stuff back in right in the run up in some instances to the Iraq War.
Right. So with the ICJ, I mean, everything they do to me is a positive step, but I don't actually understand, or maybe just because I'm stupid, but I don't really understand what they can do to enforce it. I mean, it seems like they can cajole, they can encourage, they can threaten, but ultimately, if the powers that be, which means the United States, isn't listening to them, I'm not actually sure how they follow through on these, what we would like to think would be demands, but are actually, are they more, do they have more force than sternly worded letters? I don't know.
Well, they don't have enforcement, I would say, in part because the United States is undercutting their enforcement and the United Nations Security Council enforcement mechanism as well, by basically saying a ceasefire is non-binding at every turn. So while I agree they don't have the ability to enforce, the United States could change that, and Biden could, if he wants to return to a liberal rules-based international order, as he says, he could choose to recognize the validity of international law, but actively they are not doing so.
Right. I mean, but in the sense we're, acknowledging that ultimately everything the UN does is about convincing the US to get behind whatever the UN does,
right?
Which is a bit depressing, but yes, that seems to be where we are.
Well, what's your sense of in terms of Europe? And because I think the one other implication of the ICJ making a ruling like this or creating a demand is that it gives political space for European countries the rest of the world, really, for that matter, to perhaps have their own arms embargo, to maybe talk about, trade sanctions, it gives political space for them to act in some manner that would apply more pressure to Israel and create a greater sense of isolation, because there's really two ways of going about it. It's either the U.S. Decides to cut off arms or condition things, or there's enough happening in the world that it impacts Israeli public perception of where they're at and what's going on with this war.
Right. I mean, we do see some European countries, I guess, notably Spain, taking, I guess, a harder stance, against Israel, and either continuing to fund the UN relief, or at least making noises about not being as friendly to Israel as they once were. But I mean, certainly the UK, for example, is not budging, and are not going to budge unless the US does. The David Cameron in the UK, who's the ex-prime minister, but he's back in government now. I mean, he occasionally says the right thing, but he's not shifting policy at all. So I don't see, for example, the UK changing it at all. I mean, cynically, I do think it really comes down to, not country level pressure on the country itself, or rather country level pressure on individuals in the Israeli government, that, they have to know that they're going to be international pariahs individually, because, I can't see the country of Israel being made into pariahs successfully, but perhaps only individuals. But we'll see.
I mean, that's, I guess, consistent with like Chuck Schumer coming out, and that's as far as he's going to go, and say Netanyahu, bad guy, but don't deal with him until after the war. And if he wants to come and address the joint Congress, okay.
Right, but it can't be just even. It can't be, hitting him with a soft toy, and it also just can't be in Netanyahu. I mean, it has to be. Until there's pressure on sort of everybody at high levels of government in Israel, it's not real pressure. And again, it's depressing to watch that. I don't think that can come from Spain or France, or and it's not going to come from the UK. Sadly, it does seem to have to come from the US, which runs the rules-based international order.
Well, give me your sense of of how this is being reported. What's happening in terms of like the politics relative to maybe the run up to Iraq, because it's not, these are apples and oranges type of situation. But, with Iraq, we were the ones who, as a first order, were killing and responsible for the killing of hundreds of thousands, depending on whose numbers you want to go. It could go up to 1 million people. But there seems to be more. Maybe it's because younger people are just much more engaged in a way. I don't know. What's your sense of that?
I mean, I guess I have a somewhat negative view in that, whatever we think about the Bush administration, and trust me, I think very bad things about the Bush administration. In the run up to the Iraq war, they had this strange notion that they actually had to go to the people and go to the UN and go through a farce, perhaps, but at least go through the motions of seeming to make a case for the invasion, seeming to make a case for what was about to happen, seeming to make a case, which they then abandoned, of getting UN blessing for what they did. And now it seems like, foreign policy has just become, what we say it is, what the government says it is, what Biden says it is, what the State Department says it is. And even though they came in supporting the supposed rules-based international order, this was the Biden foreign policy to return us to that. They are utterly and completely rejecting the UN. They've been mocking the UN. They have been, they accused one UN member of being an anti-Semite. I mean, there's this. In a way, it's worse than the Iraq war. And I'm not saying it's worse in every way, but I'm just saying, back then there was this idea that I think we have to listen to the UN, and now there's not even that pretense anymore.
What has changed? How did that happen? I mean, because I mean, as you say it, I mean, it occurs to me. I mean, you're right. I mean, they lied, but they felt like they had to go and lie. Like we have to be deceitful because otherwise we won't get permission on some level to do this. Was it because we were actively involved as a nation, or was it or what?
I mean, I'm not sure entirely. I mean, to a great degree, I think we have to understand that the UN has force only and influence only to the extent that we accept that it does. And I think, back then, there still was this notion that that was important. If not among people in the Bush administration themselves, among the people, the important people in the foreign policy community, among the people who wrote op-eds for newspapers. There was this idea that this mattered, even though again, it is important to remember they did abandon the UN at some point, but they did pretend for a while that was important. I think for some people in the U.S. foreign policy community, the lesson of the Iraq War was don't do any of that. Well, it didn't help them. So let's just not do that anymore. Let's just do what we want.
Netanyahu has certainly taken many lessons from the Iraq War and from the Bush administration. The human shields terminology, the not providing of any proof of claims, essentially flooding the zone with a lot of propaganda and then justifying it later. Although Israel's been engaged in that for many years as well. I see Netanyahu as a creature of the neocons in the United States too. I mean, the guy's from Philly. He's not.
So am I. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, but what I also think does fray things and makes things different, or I wasn't, covering this at the time, obviously, but the fact that it's a Democrat in office that's doing this. I mean, if Trump were basically flouting the ICJ and the United Nations in the same way, I do think, unfortunately, we would see a little bit of a different reaction from coalitions that would normally be supportive of human rights. It's just not. The opposition isn't as coherent.
No, I agree. I mean, it is a bit disheartening, as it was over different issues during the Obama administration too. There's a kind of like, well, Obama was a good guy, so whatever he's doing must be good, and some of that has transferred over to Biden. Well, Biden's a good guy, so what he's doing has been good. The people who would be, in theory, ready to oppose these things are left-leaning people. They are Democratic voters. They are in the Democratic policy community, and they, for various reasons, are much less likely to criticize a Democratic president, and yeah, internationally as well. Trump, countries would see Trump as a madman and wouldn't sort of trust him to take the lead, while either they trust Biden or they feel like they have to trust Biden, and thus they aren't going to cross him.
Let's talk a little bit about, as we look back on this week, there was a sort of interesting story with Ronna McDaniel. And some type of, I mean, I'm unclear really what actually happened with her being signed by NBC, and then supposedly MSNBC immediately said, we're not going to have her on the air, which I think was really more a little bit of a sort of retroactive story than in fact the way that it went out. But when blogs basically came on the scene back in the 2001, 2002, 2003, it was a function of there being no media that was allowed to report on the buildup to the Iraq War and the potential implications. There was a real sort of like cowed sense in the national media in the wake of 9/11. The Democrats were completely, I think, we felt at the time they were just being incredibly weak and had been cowed themselves. Talk a little bit about what you think has changed in the media since that time. I mean, obviously, a lot has. We have,
right.
we did. I don't think there was even YouTube really in the in 2002
not
or three.
Way.
Not nearly in the same way. Never mind, at that time, 2002, 3, MSNBC was a right-wing channel. I mean, Scarborough.
Alan Keyes is making sense. Yes.
Yes, exactly. And Tucker and Pat Buchanan and Scarborough Country at 10 p.m. or 8 p.m. But what's your sense of, like, how the media has changed? I don't know, in terms of on any level.
I mean, I think it's changed on so many levels, as you said, and it's no longer centered just on the top 2 newspapers and the television networks and the cable news networks. I think there is diversity of views that anyone can find now, either through shows like yours or through the internet, through social media, through Twitter or Blue Sky, or any of these other places where people find information. Various I guess not so much blogs anymore, but successors to blogs, online publications. So in a way, it's good that there is still that diversity of views. I think, which as you said, did not exist in 2002, and that's why there was space for people like me at that time. And I do think, despite everything, despite the hiring practices of NBC, despite the editorial decisions of the New York Times and the Washington Post, there are still outlets for other voices, no matter what they do, and that's very positive. If nothing else, if the New York Times publishes a bad op-ed, which they do, daily, you can have access to a bunch of people explaining to you why it was a bad op-ed. I mean, the criticism out there, the diversity of voices persists, and that's a great.
What's your sense in the way that media narratives have formed? Because when we, back in those early days, it was Drudge. Something would start in the sewers of like the right-wing fever swamps. It would get to Drudge, and then some ABC producer would go like, "Here's the news," and take it from Drudge, and so they would sort of like launder this stuff in a process. Now it feels like there's completely different sort of universes of media that don't need to combine for them to be effective in some way.
Yeah, I think the right-wing media has become, in some sense, isolated. I mean, not that it doesn't spill over into the mainstream anymore. It does somewhat, but it doesn't the way that it did back then. As you said, back then, it would be a right-wing story or a right-wing idea, a right-wing slant on things. It would be on Drudge at noon. It would be on the CNN by 4. It would be in the New York Times the next day. And that doesn't seem to happen quite as much anymore. Obviously, right-wing voices, they're still very loud, and they still, influence what gets covered, and we, for better or for worse, end up talking about them, sometimes to make fun of them, but sometimes forced to talk about them because they're putting something damaging out there, which is being embraced. But I do think they're loud, but less, in many ways, much less effective than they were, because they don't have that pathway right into the heart of CNN anymore as they once did.
Is it they don't have that pathway, or they don't need it anymore? Like, I mean, it feels like it's so self-sustaining that they don't need the validation anymore, because you can live in that sphere. They're sequestered on some level, but they are sequestered with food, water, shelter. Like, they're just living their lives there, and it's in a completely different universe. Right now, it's one where immigrants have overrun the country, and everyone's running for the to the ramparts, and completely divorced from the reality of what's going on the ground.
Right. I mean, I guess the question is, how much does it matter? I mean, does it matter or in what way does it matter, maybe is the question. I mean, does it matter if 35% of the population has this steady diet of absolutely crazy things. I suppose that does matter, but from a pure calculating electoral perspective, those are 35% of the population who would have, they would have voted for Trump anyway, or they would have voted for conservatives anyway. My take on these things was always that the more important thing was how much the right wing spilled over into the mainstream, how much they could influence, the coverage that other people received, people who weren't necessarily interested in right-wing media or didn't think that they were consuming right-wing media. They thought they were consuming, centrist media. They thought they were consuming objective media, media that was telling them the truth, telling them the news. So my concern has always more been how, the influence of the right on those outlets. In some ways, I think the more disturbing thing now is that, the conservative, to a great degree, is coming from inside the house. Like the New York Times is, I think in some ways more flawed than ever, but it's not flawed because Matt Drudge is telling them what to do, or it's flawed because their publisher is telling them what to do. And so, we used to have a conservative media problem, but it's a slightly different one.
Well, what do you think it is? Is it just that is it Salzberger is just like his inclination is to the right, or is it that sort of like classic? I mean, back in the day, we had a project, I think in 2004, and maybe we'll talk about this with Kyle a little bit more, about Adam Nagorny, who was doing ad nags. And we have the guy who actually got that domain and set up the movable type. Is going to be joining it. Yeah, Kyle. Yeah. Kyle is still making this show work, and I think we're going to have him on the phone in a little bit. But Adam Nagorny was a political reporter for the New York Times. He had people started collecting his headlines, and it was sort of fascinating to watch. Like, John Kerry too weak, John Kerry too strong. It was all over the place, and it felt like there was a dynamic where a lot of these writers at the New York Times were trying to were afraid that they were showing too much. I don't know. Liberal leg, as it were, and so really overcompensated by covering up on some level. Is it? It feels a little bit different this way in this era.
It does. I think my take on that was it was always a little bit exaggerated. We were making excuses for them a little bit. That I think a lot of these reporters, especially the political reporters, were just kind of conservative. But I do agree that they also felt the need to try to cater to an imagined audience, to try to cater to some notion of balance. While increasingly when I see these things, I don't see that it's about kowtowing to pressure. It's obviously not because the Bush administration is calling them up and yelling at them. To a great degree, I think they're doing, and by they, doing the publisher, the editor, the reporter, they're doing what they want to do. They're doing what they think they should be doing, and that's a slightly different issue. Is it because they are very conservative in their hearts, or they just have strange notions of what journalism is? I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's much less about giving into influence now than it was, and it's much more about they just think they're doing the right thing.
And they've deemed something acceptable, which is for everybody to basically reject, which is Trump's election denial, it brings us back to the Ronna McDaniel notion, where there's just been, which is very different from the Bush years, a general understanding this person is unhinged, his ideas are dangerous, he's so distasteful, that this has become so over the top that it's met this threshold for basically the entire, centrist or corporate media, right, that isn't Fox News, to deem this unacceptable. And it's in that bucket now. And I think that's given a little bit more freedom for people to speak their minds to a degree. I'm not sure. But it also does the work of helping the non-Trumpy Republicans and making them seem more acceptable than they actually are.
Yeah, all five of them. But yeah, it's there's always this battle to sort of create what a set of agreed upon facts, such that Joseph Biden won the election, to create this set of facts that if anyone deviates from that set of facts, then we can, call them a crank, and we can tell them you're a liar, or we can tell them you don't belong in our news program. But, that set of facts is always, contested. And, now that we see with, Laura Trump running the RNC now, and there are reports about how, when they're hiring people for the RNC, one of the questions they're asking is whether they believe Joe Biden won the election, and they say yes, that they're not getting hired. and so if that's the entire political party, if that's undeniably what the Republican Party is, are news organizations going to maintain this, very minor wall? Are they going to maintain this idea that excludes you from the realm of acceptable discourse? It's going to be a challenge, even if they want to do it.
Isn't it weird to you, though, that, there's all the sort of set of lies from back in that era where it was, a Paul Ryan-esque sort of Laffer curve and deficit hawkery and in things like austerity, and which were all there were whole sets of lies that were associated with that, but they were polite lies, and they were really accepted as being well thought out. That seems to have, diminished significantly, short of maybe a couple of sort of, Matt Iglesias and Nate Silverites type of people. But for the most part, a lot of that doesn't even seem to be in the discourse anymore.
It's definitely one area which, maybe doesn't get, talked about enough is what you're saying, is that even sort of mildly left-wing economic viewpoints were once considered to be sort of heretical and crazy, and now they're actually, I wouldn't say, dominant and treated as fact, but they're certainly given a place at the table much more than they were in 2002, 2003, and going into later 2006, 2007, especially with Social Security, where there was basically a lot, as you say, a lot of lies were just accepted as not just one view, but as truth, which has long been the case for economics. So we can applaud the fact that that I think is a lot better than it used to be.
All right. So final question: where will we be in 20 years?
In 20 years, well, I'm going to be 72 years old. So
you're going to be young at that time, relative to me.
72 years young, yes. So I don't know. Hopefully. Hopefully still walking. That's
not me. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about all of us. Where are we going to
be? I'm sorry, I personalized it. I don't know. That's it's difficult to really game out. I think we do
President Musk. That's the answer.
President Musk. Okay, no, we do need to get past the Donald. It's just this sticking point at the moment. It's hard to see the future at all until we get past that man, and then I'm not sure that'll change everything, but at least, or even bring things back to what we might think is normal, but at least perhaps history will progress a little bit more I don't know, in a predictable way.
I think you're right. My sense is the gains that have been made in what you talked about in terms of austerity and Social Security and some of these basic ideas of you can't have unemployment lower than 5% or 6%.
Sure.
Those gains are going to be realized once we can get back to a sort of a baseline where we can actually engage in those arguments again. We're so outside of that realm now. It seems like and I think if we get past Trump, I think maybe we've crested, but we'll see.
Think yes, right. Except for Trump, I think there has been a lot of progress, so that's good. But we'll see.
Duncan Black, real treat for all of us, but especially me. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Really happy you could make it and you're willing to do it.
Good to be here.
I know you're
Sure.
on vacation.